Abortion is at the center of the US culture wars, a battle for dominance between conflicting values. It has long split the two political parties and the country. But how did it get this way? Evangelical Christian groups have rallied to limit access to abortion for years, but it wasn't always a political issue for them. Enter Francis Schaeffer, an evangelical scholar whose son Frank encouraged him to campaign against Roe versus Wade with Christian literature and movies that they were producing. It is an extraordinary story, for without the Schaeffers, this culture war might not have been so fired up. And Frank is joining me now from Boston. His latest book is called Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. Frank, welcome to the program. I'm smiling a little bit because that title is really very, very chilled compared to some of the more apocalyptic literature and movies that you put out. I'm correct in assuming, because we stated it, that you are now very regretful of your role in this movement.
Yes, it's like hearing about someone else's life conducted on a different planet. You know, I did the work with my father and the pro-life movement in the 1970s. I'm now pushing 70 years old. This is 50 years ago. And as I look back, I can only say that not only do I regret the impact we had, of course, it was completely unforeseen, all the way up to including the murder of abortion doctors, the fact that now it looks like Roe v. Wade will be rolled back by a Supreme Court dominated by Republican operatives that have taken what we did back in the 1970s and extrapolated that out into a future 50 years later, that I find shocking. I would describe myself as a progressive, someone of liberal political views. I'm a father and grandfather. And from this perspective in my life, I look back on what I did in my youth, maybe the way I guess some people would at wartime experiences or political experiences, maybe in the 1930s in Europe, if they had joined one of the fascist parties, lived to see it play out in a world war and what happened. I feel much that level of regret and culpability.
So let's talk about what exactly you regret and how exactly you were culpable. So there you are, a young man. Your father is pretty much, you know, Christian, and you decide to convince him to oppose Roe versus Wade. Why did you do that? How did you do that? What was your father's actions and your actions at that time?
Well, I had made a film series with him on art and culture called How Should We Then Live, which was not about Roe v. Wade, but was about a Christian view of art and philosophy to counter what he regarded as secular humanism, the threat of secular humanism. And after we made that series, in shooting the last episode, Roe v. Wade was handed down at that time. And C. Everett Koop, who then was Surgeon-in-Chief of Philadelphia Children's Hospital, who a few years later would become Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, a political appointee, was a friend of my family's, also an evangelical Christian. And he came to my father's ministry, which was in Switzerland, by the way, even though it was an American English-speaking ministry called L'Abri Fellowship. And he talked me, as someone barely out of my teens, into a very staunch anti-abortion position. He said, look, you talk about Roe v. Wade in the last episode of How Should We Then Live? You need to make a whole series. Now, I have to be honest, and it saddens me, that at the time, it was also the idea of another paycheck. I was newly married. I was a teenage father talking about teen pregnancy and abortion. I was kind of living it. My wife, Jeannie, and I, we've been together 52 years now, and it worked out. But back at the time, we just had this little girl, Jessica, and I was saying, well, you know, we kept our child. Abortion is horrible. I listened to C. Everett Koop, and I was convinced. I was sincere. And so I talked my father into making the series. And of course, one of my regrets is looking back, it was totally unfair. We were living in a community. We had support. My parents were helping me. We were living free of charge in the mission. The kind of idea that somehow we had this child and everything turned out okay, and so everybody ought to be able to do this was really, you'd had to be a kind of an idiot 20, 21-year-old, 22-year-old that I was at the time, selfish, self-involved, to not be able to understand that that was not the position most people who were facing difficult pregnancies were in. So that's how it started. I was convinced by C. Everett Koop, and then I convinced my dad And then we went from there.
And you went from there to make this film with C. Everett Koop. And this film was called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. Again, it was an anti-abortion sort of doctrine. And here he is in the clip that we're about to show, standing near the Dead Sea, surrounded by hundreds of baby dolls, plastic baby dolls. And this was, you know, to symbolize aborted fetuses. This is what we're going to play from your film.
Salt. This is the site on which the city of Sodom once stood, here on the Dead Sea in Israel. Once here, under this surreal field of salt, Sodom was the most humanly corrupt city on earth, a place of evil and of death. Sodom comes readily to mind when one contemplates the evils of abortion and the death of moral law.
So, Frank, it's a pretty extraordinary sight, and it does conjure up a whole dystopian world. But you were not a particularly known filmmaker. You're a young man. How did this film impact and galvanize the anti-abortion movement?
Well, first of all, you're right. And the only reason I was directing the movie, I'd been making Super 8 films for people who remember movies back in the day since I was about 12. And I got the job producing How Should We Then Live, and then went on and directed Whatever Happened to the Human Race and wrote the screenplay for my father and Dr. C. Everett Koop for the book version. Nepotism, pure and simple. You know, me and the Korean leaders. I was a Schaefer. My father was a big evangelical star, and so I got the job. And it turned out that I had enough talent to make a strong piece of propaganda that was very effective. It was effective with evangelical audiences, but here's the thing that I think most people don't understand. At the time we brought this out in a seminar series in about 1978 through to 1980, evangelicals were not interested. Not only that, they didn't want to know. Our friend Billy Graham, the great evangelist, was pro-choice. Most evangelicals don't know that. He refused to participate with us in our seminars, even though he and my father were friends. He said, "Fran, you know, you've made a mistake here. I think women ought to have a choice." Dr. Criswell of the Southern Baptist Convention, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and for Americans, they will understand that's the most conservative group of evangelicals in America. He was pro-choice. He even preached sermons on choice. We had to convince evangelicals. You know, I think a lot of commentators looking back think somehow this was always part of the evangelical movement. It was not. Abortion was legal in the United States up until the 19th century and into the early 20th century when the American Medical Association tried to push women out of the midwife business, as it were, and take this over for professional gynecologists and so on. It had not been part of American history to be anti-abortion. It was a new phenomena that we had to talk evangelicals into. But once we talked them into it, the reason it became a thing is Republican leaders like our friend Jack Kemp, Gerald Ford, the president, my parents were friends with his. They would stay in the White House. His son, Mike, was living in my house. His wife, Gail, was babysitting our daughter, Jessica, et cetera, et cetera. We were very connected with the early stages of the religious right. Once other evangelical leaders saw this as an easy fundraising tactic to keep people angry, babies are being murdered, we can raise money. And when people like Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan and other people we knew realized that the apathetic evangelical majority that didn't even care about voting suddenly could be energized because they had lost the fight on segregation. And these segregationists like Jerry Falwell, now we gave them something new to fight. And so two big agendas happened, an anti-gay agenda and an anti-abortion agenda. And the anti-abortion agenda became the litmus test, became the red meat. That's why it caught on. It caught on because of money, fundraising by evangelical leaders, and it caught on because the Republicans suddenly said, aha, this apathetic group that barely votes and half of them vote for Democrats, we can energize them if we can create this into a moral crusade. So it was a very convenient thing for Republican leaders.
And I think all these decades later, it is extraordinary to learn from you that it was not a political issue for the evangelicals. Pretty much it was really the Catholics, right, who were mostly in the forefront of anti...
Yeah. Not only was it not a political issue, you have to understand our big fight was with evangelicals. The editorial board of Christianity Today magazine, the bastion flagship of evangelical Christianity, they were pro-choice at the time. They refused to endorse our film. Billy Graham, Dr. Criswell, on and on and on. It changed when it became a matter of convenience.
But so what
like
time?
Paul Weyrich and other right-wing activists.
Right, so what time period are we talking about? Because we know, we just mentioned, and you did, that C. Everett Koop was President Reagan's Surgeon General, and that was at the same time the rise of what's known as the moral majority with Jerry Falwell and others. What actually changed? How did it... You've talked about people realizing that it's a fundraising issue and they could fire up the base, so to speak. What was the process of making it into the issue that it is today?
We made a good film series, if you want to call it good, in the technical sense. It had a huge impact on people, and as the audiences began to grow, and then we were getting picketed by people like the National NARAL and other pro-choice organizations, and it started getting into the news. But what really changed was my father and I would go around talking to people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, the televangelist, and convincing them that this was going to be a big thing, an issue. They had to be talked into it. And that's where my father really played an instrumental role on two fronts. One, tens of thousands of evangelical Christians started watching these films in seminars and then in churches and in schools and in high schools and so forth. And then the next thing that changed, we began to convince them through the films. They were very effective as propaganda. And then the next thing that happened is that leaders like Jerry Falwell, who had been a segregationist, decided his next big issue was going to be to fight the gay rights movement and the pro-life movement. He would adopt these things as a kind of a clarion call to his people. They were talked into this by my dad. And before that, they had not been in this camp.
And they used your films, as you yourself say, very effective, actually well-made visual propaganda that you were able, you were able to use and they were able to use. I do think something is extraordinary that maybe our viewers won't remember, that also Falwell and the moral majority, they were trying to oust from power and deny a second term to then President Jimmy Carter. They were trying to get Ronald Reagan in. Of course, Jimmy Carter was the first evangelical Christian to be president. You'd think they would like that. What's that weird twist? Why were they so, focused on getting him out and Reagan in?
Well, Jimmy Carter was too decent a human being. He was compassionate to women. He was pro-choice. He was not a racist. He believed in integration. He wanted to increase voter rights for African Americans. Jerry Falwell was a segregationist. He was a far-right winger. He was a homophobe. And a nasty piece of work. It's as simple as that. And basically, Jerry Falwell and these other guys could not manipulate Jimmy Carter. He was an evangelical Christian and a Bible teacher, literally, in Sunday school, but he was, in their view, the wrong kind of Christian because they had already so politicized their vision of the gospel that they were far more interested in the politics than they were in, if you want to put it in evangelical terms, sharing the love of Jesus. This is not what interested these guys anymore. They wanted to win elections, they wanted access to power, and they got it. And of course, in Donald Trump, you have the apotheosis of this 50 years later, where this group, not these individual people, but the group that they left behind, became totally politicized, and were no longer even a religion anymore, but a political movement of the far right.
And very, very effective legal movement, too, that has waged this campaign and has now got to where it's got. You mentioned Donald Trump. Well, they got him in based on a promise to name anti-abortion judges, which he did, 3 of them. And this is where we are right now. I just want to read for you a statement after the leak of this SCOTUS ruling by the National Association of Evangelicals. They say, evangelical commitment to protecting the unborn stems from our deep understanding that God created human beings in his image and that every human life from conception to death has inestimable worth. One has to, of course, take into account the religious beliefs, the moral beliefs, some would even say some of the scientific beliefs in this statement. Talk to me about that. Because that is also part of this story. There's a big part of the country and the world who believes precisely that.
Yeah, well, first of all, the evangelicals do not believe that, because if they did, they would be fighting for paid parental leave so fathers and mothers could go home and be with their children instead of women going back to work 3 low-paid jobs with a terrible minimum wage while they're still bleeding from a cesarean section. Evangelicals don't care about that. They would not have fought, as the Republicans did, against the child tax credit that for a brief shining moment lifted millions of American children out of poverty. But they're not going to spend that money. They want to get rid of it. They call it socialism. If this group of people was pro-life and actually were consistent in their pro-life position, you could have some admiration for them while disagreeing on the matter of choice. But they are an anti-family group of people who put the welfare of billionaires in this country ahead of children, ahead of women, ahead of poor people, ahead of families. They're not even for paid parental leave. They're not for the child tax credit. They do nothing for children in terms of schools and education. They have never raised the minimum wage. They believe in people working 2, 3 jobs on the margin of poverty, and tough luck, you're on your own. So the minute that child is born, they are anti-life. They're not just anti-choice. And so this is a hypocritical movement. And then I want to say a second thing. When it comes down to these moral issues of choosing life, it all is a matter of trust. Who do we trust? Do we trust judges on the Supreme Court or the federal bench put there by Donald Trump in a bargain with people like Ralph Reed and the other evangelical leaders like Franklin Graham, who said, look, here's our list from the Federalist Society. You appoint them and we'll bring you millions of voters. And it worked. Or do we trust women? But we have to trust someone's opinion. And me personally, if I've learned anything over the last 70 years of being a father and grandfather and someone who does child care for my own children and grandchildren, it's this. If you don't trust women, why would you trust a gynecologist, a male white gynecologist? If you don't trust women to make choices, why would you trust a group of 9 judges instead of the individual woman in making the choice? I trust women. Does that mean I think women or men or non-binary people, whomever, always make the right choice? No. But you've got to give someone the choice in these matters, all matters, where to educate a child, who to marry, pair bonded, to live a gay lifestyle, to be non-binary, whatever. These are choices that belong to individuals. They do not belong to the state. And so when you see what's happening now, you understand that it's not going to end there.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you,
Frank. Start taking choices away.
That's what I was going to finish up with, because, you know, you're very passionate now. You obviously regret deeply, you know, how your talent got the US to this point in terms of a culture war. But what do you think will happen next? Because we spoke to the opposing view yesterday on this program. We gave her plenty of time to lay out her position. And she said, no. The fact that we don't want abortion doesn't mean that we're going to lobby to turn back, you know, gay marriage, interracial marriage, any of the other, you know, human rights issues that have been adjudicated by the Supreme Court. Do you believe that?
Of course not. Look at Gorsuch. Look at these people who sat there in the Senate confirmation hearings and looked right into the eyes of the senators and said, we believe that this is a stated principle that will not be changed. They gave their word. They said they would not change it. These are people are political ideologues. And the same ideology that takes away the right to choose is going to take away the right to gay marriage. The same ideology that is now changing the law in state house after state house in favor of Republican, not only gerrymandering, but the kind of thing that Donald Trump said, where he's still claiming to be president somehow, that the vote was stolen, and now all of a sudden voting rights themselves are in question. If you had gone back 40 years ago and asked Gerald Ford or any of these people, are you ever going to be part of a Republican Party that's going to push against voter rights for African Americans, they would have said that's never going to happen. Right. It's happening now. And so if anyone thinks that these people, I have to explain something to you. You know, you have an Iranian background. You're going to get these words. We are trying in this country to fight against people who are not just Democrats, but anybody who believes in democracy, people who believe in a theocracy. And what these people want is a Christian, white, nationalist version of what you have in Iran today and Saudi Arabia.
All right.
And so if you want to live in that country, then that's where we're headed.
Frank Schaeffer, you were there at the beginning. It's really, really interesting and hugely instructive to hear this story. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.